In this video, let's look at how we can use 2D photographs to simulate a virtual 3D rotation of a product. So what I'll be doing in this video is using this Monopoly character here that I have, and what I've done is I've set him up and taken photographs in a very specific way. Essentially, you can see I've put him on top of this CD here, and I've marked points on the CD that sort of show me quarters and eighths, and that allows me to take photographs of it quite accurately just by rotating the CD round to each of those points. And you can see that I've got a nice picture from each angle of this character. And essentially what I'm going to do is feed these into ActionScript inside Flash and have the user be able to control these images by clicking and dragging their mouse. And so it's kind of a quick and easy way to simulate a 3D spin of an existing product. Before I can bring these into ActionScript though, I've got a little bit of cleaning up that I need to do in order to get these ready to present inside Flash. So what I've done inside Photoshop is I've just imported each of these files into a Photoshop document and placed them on a separate layer, and I've lined them all up. So essentially, if I start revealing these, let's start from the bottom. You can see how I've got this partial turn, then more of a complete turn here, and he continues to turn around. And you'll notice that what I've done with each of these files is that I've removed the background, and that just helps with presentation. It also means that I can define the background in Flash instead of having to use the existing background that we see here, which is just not very nice. So a quick and easy way to do this is to just use this guy here, which is our quick selection tool. So I'm just going to paint inside the Monopoly Man, select his arms and his hands. And the cool thing about this tool is that it kind of guesses what you want to select, and sometimes it makes a mistake. You can see here it's selected too much, and in that case just hold down the Alt key and you can subtract from the selection. You can just kind of tidy this up a little bit. Okay, let's add these little black regions in here. We should be good to go. So then we can just click to add a layer mask down here from that selection, and we've removed the background. So I did that for each of my images, and I also used levels adjustments to brighten them up and make them more presentable. And once I'd done that, I'm sure to resize the image, and in this case I did 1024 and it came to 746 so that it's more suitable for online viewing. So you'll need to consider the resolution of your final Flash output. Don't just import at the original camera resolution, because that could be between 4 and 5K. And once that's done, I just selectively reveal each layer and save these out as PNG files. And PNG because it saves the transparency into the image. So I give them, version 1, 2, 3, etc. Then we're ready to move into Flash. And what I've done is I've set up a folder here. You can see we've got frames where I've stored all my PNG files. I can just scroll through these to check them, make sure they're in the right order, and the character doesn't jump too much. And then I've just created a Flash file at the root, and I've got my recover files here. Those will disappear once I close Flash. So what I need to do first is import my PNG files. So I'm just going to go to File, Import, Import to Library, and select all these PNG files, open, and they'll all appear nicely here in my library. And what I like to do is just create a new folder. I'll just call this Images, just keep everything nice and organized, put those in there. At this point, we're ready to create our symbol. But before we go ahead and do that, let's actually look at how this file that I've got here has been set up. On the very first layer and first frame of my timeline, you can see I've got some ActionScript here that I've written. And if I do right click in Actions, you can see this action script is designed to control the mouse position and the click events of the user, and according to how they drag their mouse, it's actually going to spin or change those frames. So before we really dig into this though, let's finish setting up our graphics and then we'll return back to this. So I'm going to create a new symbol here, and I'm going to call this symbol, we'll call this Monopoly Man, and I'm going to make sure it's a movie clip so that I can control the timeline independently using ActionScript. I'll click OK. And at this point, what I'm going to do is quite simply place each of these images that I've exported onto a different frame in the timeline. It's as simple as that. So at frame 1, I've got an empty keyframe. I'll drag image 1 into place. Zoom out a little bit. Frame 2, I'm going to insert an empty keyframe. You can either right click, insert blank keyframe, or you can just hit F7 on your keyboard. So bring in number 2, and keep doing this. F7, number 3, frame 4, F7, number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so if I scrub the timeline, you see what you get. Kind of a crude rotation of this character. Obviously, the more images you take at reduced increments as this guy rotates around, the smoother the rotation would be. So if you took maybe 100 pictures, you'd get a very smooth transition on this rotation. The next problem is that you can see that the images don't really line up properly. So what I like to do is, because I've aligned these in Photoshop, I'm actually going to zero them all out. So I'm going to go to my window, and I'm going to go down to Transform, and look at the info palette for the selected graphic. And you can see that the X and Y positions here have these random numbers in according to where I've placed this object. Let's bring info back again. In fact, let's just break this off so we can keep it open. And I'm going to zero out X and zero out Y. And you can see it registers according to the top left-hand corner of the image. So for each of these images, I'm going to just go ahead and zero these out. And that way I know that they're perfectly aligned inside my symbol. And you could do this on the main timeline. You don't have to do it inside its own symbol. But I like to do a symbol because it gives me more control about where I later decide to place this animation. I can scale it, rotate it, make it disappear, make it reappear, change the transparency within my main scene, and I don't have to worry about messing up the action scripting I've created here to organize its placement. So now when I scroll these, you can see that they line up nicely. We've got a little rotation there. So let's go back to the main scene and close this down. At this point then, what I can do is I've got my symbol. I can just drag this onto my stage. And I'll center it up. What happens at the beginning if you try and just run this is you're going to get some compile errors and you just get an endless loop where it continues to spin. So at this point it's important to look at the action script and see how this is actually working. So go to the timeline, right click frame 1, actions. Let's look at the very first thing we're doing. I'm storing some variables to set the initial mouse position the user has, and then I'm storing other variables to check whether or not the mouse is actually being held down. We've got a frame number that's being stored in memory. Now this is really important. The first thing I need to do is actually stop the timeline of my little person here. And you'll notice that by default I've called the instance spin. And I'm talking to that timeline and telling it to stop. Now you could call that anything you want, but I just called it spin. And what that refers to is the instance name of this symbol. So if you select the symbol as it is on the stage, look at the properties, we need to give it an instance name. In this case, we'll call it spin to match the action script. So one of the first things that the action script does is it tells the spin to stop playing its timeline. Remember, a movie clip's timeline is independent from the timeline of the main flash file. Then we execute a function called change frame, which really is setting up the event listeners. So we're listening for mouse clicks, either clicks down or mouse clicks up or releases. And according to what the user does, we essentially go ahead and perform an action. So let's look at what these actions are. If the mouse is held down, we know that the user wants to move or rotate the image. And so what we do is we just quite simply increase the frame or decrease the frame, depending on which way the user drags their mouse. If we get to the end of the frame range, remember there's only 8 frames on that symbol timeline, we just reset it back to 1. And the same is true in reverse. If we get back down to frame 1, we set the frame to 8. And then here, quite simply, we look to see if the mouse is being held down, and if it is, we set the initial value of the mouse. The important thing when looking at this script is just to make sure that your instance name spin is set up the same as the instance on your actual stage. Once you've done that, Control Enter, and now you can see that the timeline stops, which is what we expect, and the user can now click and drag to the left to rotate this way, or drag to the right to rotate this way. So you've done some very simple action script to set up the rotations for this object. And the great thing about setting these up as symbols is that you can now transform these using the Q key. You can change the size, you can even rotate it, run it again, and you can see that it still behaves like we would expect it to. So that's a very simple way to use 2D photographs of an object to create a virtual 3D spin inside ActionScript.